Thank you, Julie. All right, can you guys hear me okay? Does it sound good, crystal clear? Okay, cool. So I'm going to keep this short. In fact, I'm going to start my timer here so I don't go over. Today's chat is on, I titled this, it wants my face ID, I'm sorry. Nourishing your family in the midst of dietary confusion. And for me, this so perfectly embodies how we felt when we started our real food journey. We were so confused, right? I think if I asked 10 people in the room what healthy food is, everyone would give a different answer. And so it was really challenging. And I hope to weed through some of that clutter and confusion and just give you really simple, tangible takeaways for today. So a little bit about me. My name's Liz Haselmayer. I'm a wife, a homeschooling mother to these 3 beautiful girls, founder of Homegrown Education, host a podcast, love really good food and drink. That's pretty much what sums me up. So our family's real food journey, it really started about 7 years ago and came after an unexpected diagnosis of our middle daughter. And on that journey, I really started to question everything in my home, right? From underneath my sink to the food in my pantry, my cleaners, everything. I began to scrutinize because I realized there was a connection between my lifestyle and my overall health and the health of the next generation, truthfully. So we were watching this unfold, and a lot of what I was learning was really inspired by what I call this historical lens of food, right? So I kept asking myself, what would we have eaten before XYZ was invented or before marketing departments sold me on a certain topic or a particular food, right? And so we'll go over that today, but it really started out as kind of a restrictive diet. I was eliminating whole food groups, and now today it's really an all-inclusive lifestyle, and it's amazing. I say we walk in food freedom, and that's important for me as a woman raising 3 daughters, and so it's really continued to evolve over time, and will continue to do so. So why is there so much dietary confusion? Well, one, let's talk about food restrictions, which I just mentioned. There's gluten-free, there's dairy-free, there's no nightshades, right? And a lot of this is valid. And if you're in a season of healing and you need to eliminate a certain food group for a period of time, 100% on board with that. But the problem is that we've coupled this with all of these healing diets, right? We've got paleo, keto, AIP, and then we've got food labels. So you walk into the grocery store and you're inundated with organic, non-GMO, cage-free, and you're like, what, is there even any real definition to these? What do these actually mean? And so what we see is we've got a confused consumer, we've got a chronically ill population who is finally looking to food for their answer, which is fantastic, but then every person you talk to seems to have a different piece of information that might be conflicting to the one you just heard. So it's confusing. And then probably the most important piece of this is that our food system has changed over the last several decades right under our noses, and we don't even talk about it as a society. It has become industrialized, commoditized, and centralized. And so some of the ways that this has changed is we now use agrochemical farming, right? Before World War II, that wasn't a thing. We took these chemical warfare compounds and then we apply them to the agricultural space. We genetically modify our foods. We see ultra processing everywhere in the grocery store. And we've really shifted our dietary fat intake to focus on these polyunsaturated fats instead of the traditional fats that we've eaten before. So all of these things couple with the fact that every year or every 5 years, we're getting advice on what we should eat. And some of it is very common sense and makes sense, right? I can get on board with the USDA's advice to eat vegetables and fruits. I can get on board with that. But then some of these other ones, I wanted to drill down a little bit and ask, okay, if you're going to recommend grains, of which half should be whole grains, there's more to that story, right? How are those grains being prepared? How were they farmed? How were they raised? Were they desiccated via a chemical compound, or were they just let to dry out by the sun and natural air? There's a lot more to each of these layers, dairy, protein, and fats we're going to get into tonight, but just wanted to paint a broader picture of some of the ways that we're all walking around with different opinions about food, and that's okay, but there are some through lines that we can pull from historical context. Here's another good image. This is from the 2020 to 2025 guidelines. And I just want to point your attention to the vegetable oil and butter, right? So here we have a really traditional food, butter, and the USDA in the most recent guidelines, because of their recommendations of fat, would really push you to consume vegetable oils. But we have to ask ourselves, what's a vegetable oil? Well, I'll tell you right now, vegetable oils aren't made of vegetables. They're made of seeds, and it's a high intensity process with lots of oxidation, lots of denaturing. And it's just one example of how if you drill in or dial into a specific food, there's so much more to the story. There's so much more. So, as I said, you know, the USDA gets some information right, absolutely. But where I felt like they diverted from our common sense that applied to our family, we're in just some of these categories. So, we're going to go into, I want to give you a lens going forward. How can you define what real food is and what real food is not, right? So, I like to say things that are naturally occurring. Does this exist in nature? Can I make this in my kitchen? Is this pretty simple to utilize? Does it have a list of 5,000 ingredients and it was, you know, chemically altered and made in a facility, right? Those two things are going to be vastly different. Is it nutrient dense? Let's talk about the fact that we want our food to nourish us. We want it to contain healthy proportions of fat, protein, and carbohydrates. Is it unrefined? Right? So an example of a refined food would be like a white flour and a skim milk. We've taken a portion of that food out, we've refined it to some degree, and so it's left us with a completely different product. And then is it not denatured? Denaturing of a food, again, looks like altering it on a molecular or chemical level, and so that's, again, going to be some of the processing that we do to our dairy renders it completely denatured. And then finally, how are we preparing that in our homes? Are we careful to properly prepare particular vegetables so that we're not eating tons of raw veggies with a lot of plant toxins or protective mechanisms? Are we soaking or sour leavening or fermenting our grains in any way? So this is just a great kind of all-encompassing, like I said, lens to look through your food. So for the rest of the talk, I'm just going to break down our 5 most nourishing foods that we enjoy in our household on a daily or weekly basis. We're going to talk about real dairy, sourdough, meat stock, traditional fats, and fermented foods. I'm starting with raw dairy because if you're like me and you haven't heard of raw dairy, you're probably thinking that's dangerous, scary, and what are you even talking about? What is raw dairy? And so for this one, again, I had to look into some of the historical context around food. What did we do before Louis Pasteur, right? What did we do before he came on the scene? And he was actually solving a problem, right? Pasteurization was a solution to sick cows in dirty environments. And so I wish I could talk on this whole topic for 20 minutes, but I can't. So I'm doing a high-level gloss of this. But just as a summary, we took a very agrarian culture where people had their maybe own family cows and they were enjoying milk straight from their own cow. And we moved these people and packed them into cities. And then instead of cows grazing on pasture, cows were now grazing on stuff that was not necessarily biologically appropriate, like grain from a distiller, right? And so now we've got sick cows with literal bovine tuberculosis, and now we're feeding this milk, unadulterated, to families, and people are dying. And that's a real thing, right? This is kind of like the late 1800s, you know, kind of turn of the century where this is happening. And this is where Louis Pasteur came on the scene. But today, we understand what a cow needs. We understand that in healthy environments with healthy cows, whole, raw, unadulterated dairy is a wonderful food, right? It's not got any of its proteins denatured. We can consume it in its whole form. It's more digestible because the consumption of it facilitates lactase in our gut, which is the enzyme needed to break down lactose. And so we take a really traditional food, we process it in a number of different ways through pasteurization and homogenization, sell it in a grocery store, and then we wonder why so many people struggle with it, right? So today we have testing. Today we can test for cow health. Today we can test for harmful pathogens in the milk. And today we also understand something called the microbiome, where we realize that our insides are not sterile, and we need a live teeming activity of healthy microbes in our system. So we don't need to fear things just because they've got little tiny creatures in them, right? Sourdough is another one. So this one was really liberating for me because I was on the grain-free and gluten-free train. And again, if that's where you are, fantastic, stick with that. But for me, I was not allergic to gluten. I was avoiding it out of fear of what that protein was. And so I took information I learned about sourdough and realized, hold up, I can ferment this stuff. I can cultivate wild yeast and bacteria that lives in my kitchen and in my flour, and I can make this living starter. I mean, nothing is cooler than looking at this little jar bubbling over with life and realizing like you are so tiny on this world. Like there's so much else out there. So sourdough has been amazing because it allows us to consume products and not just like this beautiful crusty loaf of bread, right? You can make sourdough into anything that is leavened with yeast, right? So you could make pancakes or pizza dough or muffins or cakes even. And what this does is through this process, we're helping break down some of those anti-nutrients and we're helping make this more digestible. Some people say you're pre-digesting the grain, but again, if you look back to how we made bread before we had tiny packets of instant yeast, it was through a traditional sourdough. So now we embrace that every day. I just made my sourdough breads out there. I've made it, 3 to 4 times a week for the last 2 years probably, and it's been life-changing. Love it. Traditional fats. So here's another one, right? So what have we consumed before the 1950s demonized the consumption of saturated fat and scared us about dietary cholesterol? If you look back to what would have been available to us, it was those animal fats. It was that fat from dairy, that butter. Now we also do ghee, and we do coconut oil, and we do beautiful cold pressed olive oils, right? So I'll skip to this slide. There are great options that olive oil, coconut oil, and avocado oil. I call these fruit oils because those are fruits, right? And vegetable oil altogether is a completely different thing. Something I like to talk about is the fact that canola is not a plant. There's no such thing as a canola plant. It's literally an acronym, and it stands for Canadian Oil Low Ureic Acid. And what happened is in the 1970s, some Canadians thought that we should take the seeds of this rape plant and take the oils out, but the ureic acid was too high, so we reduced that, and then we slapped an acronym on it. Then we have canola oil. Canola oil is one of the most widely used oils in homes, in the restaurant industry, everywhere you go. If you look on organic packaged goods, you'll see organic canola oil or sunflower oil or something like that. So instead, we have adopted some of the traditional fats, right? Lard, tallow, poultry fat, olive oil, coconut oil, all of these things we use on a regular basis. Fermented foods, which we will talk about later today. I think there's going to be a demo, actually. This is another example of we're told to take a probiotic, but the probiotic bacteria has been cultivated in a petri dish with maybe a couple other strains or maybe on its own. There's no competitive environment there, and so by the time we swallow that probiotic pill, who's to say that any of those microbes are actually setting up camp and making a home in our digestive tract, which is exactly what they're supposed to do. Instead, we can cultivate the same microbiotic community, or better, even more diverse, at home using traditional fermentation, right? Lacto fermentation, which usually just requires a salt brine and some vegetables, is a really simple, easy way to make sure that you're diversifying your gut microbiome, that you're helping your kids get a step forward, because that's huge for us. We know that every year our kids' diversity, or every generation, it lessens and lessens. And so this is such a simple way to do that. So we've got just basic vegetables, water, salt, and that's in a fermentation weight, and it works really well. For us, this means we make kraut about once a month, and then it lets us enjoy that with some of our other dinners, and we've done fermented green beans and all types of things. So, and then finally, meat stock, which again, I have some in the cafe area for you to sample, but this is another great healing food that we make every single week. What we do is we roast a whole chicken. That way we have the carcass of the chicken that we can make a meat stock with. And meat stock differs a little bit from a bone broth. It's going to be cooked with more meat, more connective tissue, more skin on it, and so it's going to take less time for all of those nutrients to leach into the liquid. And so instead of cooking bone broth for maybe 12 to 24 hours, you only have to cook meat stock for about 4. It still contains a lot of protein, a lot of amazing collagen and minerals, and it's one of the foundational elements of the GAPS diet, which is completely designed to help heal your gut. And so the way we use this is we'll drink it as in a cup with a pinch of salt, which is how we have it out there. We'll use it to cook our rice in. We'll use it as the base of soups and stocks, and it's just a really simple, nourishing way to get some good mineral and protein-rich foods into us and, like I said, into our kids. So as a summary, this is kind of where I just encourage people to start, right? Be a family or a household that buys ingredients instead of buying food, right? Start with the whole raw ingredient, if you will, as best you can. If that means buying a whole chicken instead of a butchered, boneless, skinless chicken breast, right? You're gonna get a lot more bang for your buck there. And then you can make a meat stock with it. Go for, if you can invest in half a cow, you're gonna get a lot of cuts of meat that you have maybe never had exposure to, or you're gonna get meat on the bones. You're also gonna get some of that fat and some of the organs. If we're talking about consuming animals, let's make sure we honor that animal's life and consume the whole thing. I encourage you guys to connect to a local farm. There was a great example of one out in the cafe lobby area earlier, and connecting to a local farm, especially for people like me who live in the suburbs, is just so helpful, because then we can understand some of the processes and just really get plugged into our local food economy. Focusing on quality fats is a big one for us. Like I said, ditching the vegetable oils and going to some of those more traditional fats that we've been using since the beginning of time, right? And then emphasizing nourishing foods over food restrictions. This one's huge, especially as a parent. I know it can be really hard when we're looking at every morsel of our kids' diet and we're trying to make sure that they're getting everything they need, and then you go to the grocery store and they offer your kid a box of, I don't even know, some kind of candy. This happened to me one time. I was checking out and she said, "Oh, we're giving away these extra large candy bars. Would you like one?" And I said, "Well, you just asked in front of my kids, so I mean, sure." And so it can be really easy to be like, "Oh, this is not what we want. I want to restrict this as much as possible." But that's not how the world works. And so if we can focus on all of the beautiful home-cooked meals I served before that day and then everything they're gonna get after, it just creates a healthier kind of food freedom environment. And so those are my high-level main points there. So if you wanna connect with us, like I said, each of these topics could go on for hours, and we have. So we have a podcast where we talk about raw dairy and sourdough, and we interview amazing farmers and all kinds of people. That's the Homegrown podcast. Free resources like our sourdough guide and our raw dairy guide, which is just pages and pages of information you never thought you would want to know, but they're amazing. And then we do have some meal plans just to help your kids. So I think that's all I have for you. And then I have, are we doing Q&A stuff?
Yeah.